The morning air was bitingly cold in Boston as Amy hurried along the crowded sidewalk, clutching her coffee cup for warmth. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid December air as she weaved through the sea of coats and scarves. It was just another Monday, or so she thought, until fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Just 2 blocks from her office, something made her slow her usual brisk pace. There, huddled against the brick wall of an old bookstore, sat a woman who seemed different from the other homeless people Amy usually passed. Despite her worn clothes and weathered appearance, there was an undeniable grace about her. She wasn't asking for money or holding a sign. Instead, she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain dignity in the face of circumstances Amy couldn't begin to imagine. The woman caught Amy's eye, and in that brief moment of eye contact, Amy saw something that touched her deeply. There was wisdom in those eyes, along with a profound sadness that seemed to tell a story of better days long past. The woman quickly looked away, as if embarrassed to be seen in her current state. Amy found herself stopping, something she had never done before. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the universe puts people in our path for a reason. The cashmere scarf around her neck suddenly felt heavy with meaning. It was her most treasured possession, the last gift her grandmother had given her before passing away the previous year. Without fully understanding why, Annie began unwrapping the scarf from her neck. The woman looked up, surprised by the shadow that had fallen across her. "You look like you could use this more than I do," Amy said softly, holding out the scarf. Her voice trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the emotion of the moment. The woman hesitated, her hands remaining folded in her lap. "I couldn't possibly," she began, her voice carrying an unexpected refinement that caught Amy off guard. But Amy had already started gently wrapping the soft cashmere around the woman's shoulders. "I'm Rose," the woman said finally, touching the scarf with trembling fingers. Her eyes welled up with tears she tried to hide. This is very kind of you." Amy sat down on the cold concrete beside Rose, no longer concerned about getting to work on time. There was something about this woman that made everything else seem less important. "Would you like to share my coffee?" Amy offered, surprising herself with the words, "It's still hot." As Rose carefully accepted the cup, her hands shaking slightly from the cold, she spoke again. "You know, I used to be the one helping others." She took a small sip of the coffee, closing her eyes briefly as the warmth spread through her body. Life has a funny way of turning things upside down sometimes. Amy listened as Rose shared small fragments of her story, each word revealing a person who had once lived a very different life. The morning crowd continued to hurry past them, but in that moment, Amy and Rose existed in their own quiet bubble of human connection. Before rising to leave, Amy slipped her business card into the scarf's pocket, an action that would later prove more significant than she could have imagined. "Please," she said, "keep the scarf. It looks beautiful on you." As Amy finally walked away, she felt something had fundamentally shifted in her understanding of the world. The simple act of stopping, of seeing another person's humanity, had created a ripple that would soon grow into a wave of unexpected changes. What neither woman knew in that moment was that this chance encounter on a cold Boston morning was just the beginning of an extraordinary story. The scarf that had once been a reminder of Amy's grandmother would soon become a symbol of something much larger, a testament to how a single moment of kindness can set in motion events that change lives forever. The streets of Boston had witnessed countless human interactions over the centuries, but few would prove as meaningful as this simple exchange between 2 strangers on a cold December morning. As Amy finally arrived at her office, late but somehow not caring, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. She was right, but she had no way of knowing just how right she was. 2 weeks had passed since that cold morning when Amy had given her grandmother's scarf to Rose. The memory of their encounter kept drifting back to her thoughts, especially during quiet moments at work. She often wondered how Rose was doing, if the scarf was keeping her warm, and what circumstances had led someone so well-spoken to end up on the streets. The city had been hit with an unusually harsh winter, and Amy found herself taking the same route to work each day, hoping to see Rose again. But the spot by the old bookstore remained empty. Sometimes she would pause there, remembering their conversation, before continuing her daily routine. One particularly cold afternoon, as Amy was preparing to leave her office, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, and she almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer it though, a decision that would change everything. "Hello, is this Amy Chen?" a professional voice asked. "This is Nurse Thompson from Massachusetts General Hospital. We have a patient here who was brought in earlier today. We found your business card in her possession in the pocket of a cashmere scarf." Amy's heart skipped a beat. "Rose? Is she okay?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Her hand gripped the phone tighter as she waited for the response. "She's being treated for severe pneumonia," the nurse explained. "She was found unconscious near the public library this morning. We're trying to piece together her information, but she hasn't been very responsive since arriving. Your card was the only contact we could find." Without hesitation, Amy grabbed her coat. "I'm on my way," she said, already heading for the door. The winter sun was setting early, casting long shadows across the city as she hurried to the hospital. Her mind raced with thoughts of Rose, alone and sick on the streets during these freezing nights. At the hospital, Amy found herself directed to the intensive care unit. The stark fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell created a harsh contrast of her last memory of Rose on the street. Through the window of room 342, she could see a figure in the bed, looking small and fragile under the hospital blankets. The cashmere scarf was folded neatly on the bedside table. As Amy stood there, a doctor approached her. "Are you the one who gave her the scarf?" he asked, introducing himself as Dr. Richards. When Amy nodded, he continued, "You might have saved her life, you know. If we hadn't found your card, we wouldn't have known anything about her. She's been in and out of consciousness, but she mentioned your kindness several times." Amy spent the next few hours by Rose's bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. She noticed how different Rose looked in the hospital bed, cleaned up, her silver hair neatly combed, her face peaceful despite the oxygen mask covering it. As evening turned to night, something extraordinary happened. A nurse came in to check Rose's vitals and stopped abruptly, staring at her patient's face. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, then hurried out of the room. Minutes later, she returned with an older doctor who looked like he had just seen a ghost. "It can't be," the doctor muttered, checking Rose's chart again and again. "This is Dr. Eleanor Rose Thompson. She was one of our best pediatric surgeons years ago." We all thought. His voice trailed off as he shook his head in disbelief. Amy sat there, stunned by this revelation. The woman she had met on the street, the one whose dignity had struck her even in the midst of hardship, had once been a respected surgeon in this very hospital. The pieces of Rose's story were starting to come together, but there were still so many questions. As if sensing she was being talked about, Rose stirred slightly. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing first on the familiar hospital ceiling, then on Amy's face. A faint smile crossed her lips as recognition dawned in her eyes. "You kept the scarf," Amy said softly, touching the folded cashmere on the bedside table. "It reminded me that there was still kindness in the world," Rose whispered weakly through the oxygen mask. "When everything else seemed lost, that meant something." The old doctor was already on his phone, making calls, his voice urgent and excited. Something big was happening, something that would soon reshape both Rose's and Amy's lives in ways neither of them could imagine. But for now, in that quiet hospital room, it was just two souls connected by a simple act of kindness, watching the city lights twinkle through the window as the winter night deepened outside. The story of the scarf was far from over. In fact, it was about to take turns that would leave everyone speechless. But that would have to wait for another day, as Rose drifted back to sleep, her hand resting gently on the folded cashmere that had brought her back to a world she thought she had lost forever. The hospital buzzed with a strange energy in the days following Rose's identification. Word spread quickly through the medical staff that the mysterious homeless patient was actually Dr. Eleanor Rose Thompson, the brilliant pediatric surgeon who had vanished 5 years ago. The story began to unfold like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Amy visited every day after work, watching as Rose grew stronger. During one of these visits, Rose finally felt well enough to share her story. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the hospital window as she began to speak, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I had everything once," Rose said, adjusting herself in the hospital bed. "A thriving career, a loving husband, a beautiful home overlooking the harbor. She paused, touching the cashmere scarf that still lay folded on her bedside table. Then my husband Tom got sick. Cancer. It was aggressive, and within 6 months, he was gone. Amy sat quietly, watching as Rose's fingers traced the pattern on the scarf. The older woman's eyes were distant, lost in memories. After Tom died, I tried to keep going. I performed surgeries, saved children, threw myself into research. But something inside me had broken. Rose's voice trembled slightly. Depression crept in slowly at first, then all at once. Like a wave that starts small but ends up drowning you. The hospital corridor outside was busy with activity, but in room 342, time seemed to stand still as Rose continued her story. She told Amy about gradually withdrawing from her life, missing appointments, forgetting to pay bills. How one day she simply walked out of her house and didn't return, leaving everything behind. I couldn't bear to be Dr. Thompson anymore, she explained. That person was tied to Tom, to our life together, to everything I'd lost. So I became just Rose, another invisible person on the streets. And somehow that was easier. As Rose spoke, Dr. Chen, the hospital's current chief of surgery, appeared in the doorway. He had been one of Rose's colleagues years ago, and the look on his face was a mixture of joy and disbelief. Rose, he said softly, we've been looking for you for years. Not just because we missed you, but because there's something you need to know. Rose looked up, confusion crossing her face. Dr. Chen pulled up a chair and began explaining about the pediatric heart valve procedure she had helped develop before disappearing. The patent had been approved, and the device was now being used in hospitals across the country. There was a substantial amount of money waiting for her, her share of the royalties that had been accumulating all these years. Your research has saved hundreds of children, Dr. Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. While you were gone, your work never stopped helping people. Amy watched as Rose absorbed this information, tears sliding down her cheeks. The woman who had sat so quietly on the street, who had accepted a scarf with such grace, was starting to remember who she had been, and perhaps who she could be again. That evening, as visitors were being ushered out, Rose caught Amy's hand. Thank you, she whispered, not just for the scarf, but for seeing me when I couldn't see myself anymore. The next few days brought a flurry of activity. Social workers helped Rose access her bank accounts and begin the process of reclaiming her identity. Former colleagues stopped by with photos and memories, helping to bridge the gap between her past and present. The hospital administration offered her a position as a consultant once she was fully recovered, understanding that she might need time before returning to surgery. But the most remarkable transformation was in Rose herself. With each passing day, her posture became straighter, her voice stronger. The dignity Amy had first noticed on the street was blooming into something more. A quiet confidence, a return to self. One morning, Amy arrived to find Rose sitting in a chair by the window, dressed in regular clothes instead of a hospital gown. The cashmere scarf was draped elegantly around her shoulders, and she was reviewing medical journals spread across her lap. I've decided, Rose announced, looking up as Amy entered. I want to use part of the patent money to open a clinic for homeless patients. People who've lost their way, like I did. Will you help me plan it? Amy smiled, remembering that cold morning when she'd first stopped to talk to Rose. How a simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would touch countless lives. But this wasn't the end of their story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. Spring had arrived in Boston, bringing with it new beginnings. Rose had been released from the hospital weeks ago, but the real journey was just beginning. She had moved into a comfortable apartment near the hospital, its walls slowly filling with recovered photographs and mementos from her previous life. The cashmere scarf now hung proudly by the door, a daily reminder of the moment everything changed. Amy had become a regular visitor, often dropping by after work to help Rose with her ambitious plans for the clinic. This evening, they sat at Rose's kitchen table, surrounded by papers and architectural drawings. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as they pored over the details. I think this location would be perfect, Rose said, pointing to a map of the city. It's near the shelter district, accessible by public transport, and the building has good bones. Her eyes sparkled with purpose, a far cry from the lost soul Amy had met that winter morning. As they worked, Rose shared more of her story, filling in the gaps of those lost years. She told Amy about the kind people she'd met on the streets, fellow souls who had shared their food and blankets despite having so little themselves. About the librarian who had let her sit in the warm reading room during the coldest days, pretending not to notice she wasn't actually reading. You know what's strange? Rose mused, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. When I was a successful surgeon, I thought I understood compassion, but it wasn't until I lost everything that I truly learned what it meant. Sometimes the smallest kindnesses mean the most, like a stranger giving you their scarf on a cold morning. Amy blushed, still uncomfortable with being praised for what she considered a simple act of human decency. But Rose wasn't finished. That's why this clinic has to be different, she continued, spreading out the floor plans. Yes, we'll provide medical care, but we'll also offer dignity. A place where people can feel seen and heard, where they're treated as human beings first, patients second. The plans were ambitious. Beyond basic medical services, the clinic would include shower facilities, a clothing bank, and a small cafeteria serving hot meals. There would be mental health counselors on staff and social workers to help people navigate the complex system of available services. Look at this, Rose said excitedly, pulling out a sketch. We'll have a garden on the roof. A place where people can sit in the sun, grow vegetables, feel connected to something living and growing. When I was on the streets, I missed that the most, having a quiet, peaceful place to just be. As they worked into the evening, more visitors arrived. Dr. Chen stopped by with updates on the patent royalties and news that several other doctors had volunteered to help staff the clinic. A local architect who had heard Rose's story offered her services pro bono. Even the owner of the old bookstore where Amy had first met Rose came by with a donation of books for the clinic's waiting room. But the most touching moment came when a group of Rose's former patients arrived. Now adults with children of their own, they had read about her story in the local paper. They brought old photos of themselves as children, their chest scars proudly displayed, living proof of the lives she had saved with her surgical skills. We never forgot you, Dr. Thompson, one young mother said, hugging Rose tightly. When we heard what happened, well, we want to help with the clinic too. Whatever you need. Amy watched as Rose embraced her former patients, saw how each reunion helped heal something in both Rose and those she had helped. The room was filled with a special kind of energy, the kind that comes when people unite around a purpose bigger than themselves. Later that night, as Amy prepared to leave, she found Rose standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. The cashmere scarf was wrapped around her shoulders, its soft fabric catching the lamplight. You know, Rose said softly, when I was living on the streets, I used to look up at these same lights and feel so disconnected from everything. Now I look at them and see possibilities. Stories waiting to be changed. Lives waiting to be touched. She turned to Amy, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I never thought I'd find my way back. But that scarf, it was like a lifeline. A reminder that someone saw me, really saw me, when I couldn't even see myself. Amy hugged her friend goodbye, stepping out into the spring evening. The air was soft with promise, so different from that winter morning that now seemed so long ago. As she walked home, she thought about how life's biggest changes often start with the smallest choices, like stopping to help a stranger on a cold morning. The clinic was still months away from opening, but its impact was already being felt. Rose's story had inspired others to look differently at the people they passed on the streets, to remember that every person has a story, a past, and the potential for a different future. Summer arrived, bringing with it the exciting buzz of construction as Rose's dream began taking physical shape. The old building they'd chosen was transforming day by day, its worn brick exterior getting cleaned while the inside underwent a complete renovation. The sound of hammers and drills filled the air, mixing with the cheerful chatter of volunteers who showed up daily to help. Amy had taken to spending her lunch breaks at the construction site, watching the progress and helping where she could. Today, she sat with Rose on a stack of lumber, sharing sandwiches and iced tea while workers installed new windows nearby. Sometimes I have to pinch myself, Rose said, watching as a large pane of glass was carefully lifted into place. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in doorways. Now look at this. She gestured at the bustling activity around them. It's like a miracle. But it wasn't just a miracle, it was the result of countless people coming together. The local medical community had rallied around Rose's vision, donating equipment and promising their time. Business owners in the area offered supplies and services. Even the city council had fast-tracked the permits when they heard the clinic's purpose. "Remember that couple we met on Franklin Street?" Rose asked, her voice softening. "The ones who shared their blanket with me last winter? I found out they're still there." She paused, her eyes distant. "I want them to be among our first patients when we open." As if on cue, a delivery truck pulled up, bringing the first batch of medical supplies. Rose's face lit up as she went to supervise the unloading. Annie watched her friend direct the workers with gentle authority, noting how naturally she had stepped back into a leadership role. The afternoon brought more visitors. A group of nursing students arrived, eager to volunteer at the clinic once it opened. They clustered around Rose, listening intently as she shared her vision for patient care. Her experiences on both sides of the medical system had given her unique insights into what people really needed. "It's not enough to just treat symptoms," Rose explained to the students. "We need to treat the whole person. That means listening to their stories, understanding their struggles, and helping them find their way back to themselves." She touched the cashmere scarf she still wore despite the summer heat. Sometimes healing starts with something as simple as being seen. Later, as the construction crew packed up for the day, Amy and Rose walked through the partially finished rooms. The space was already taking on a welcoming feel, with large windows letting in natural light and walls painted in warm, soothing colors. "This will be the community room," Rose said, stepping into a large space near the entrance. "We'll have comfortable chairs, books, computers for job searches. A place where people can just sit and feel safe for a while." Her voice caught slightly. "I spent so many hours in the public library just trying to stay warm. I want this to be different." They moved through the building, their footsteps echoing on the new floors. The examination rooms were nearly complete, their fresh paint gleaming. The rooftop garden was starting to take shape, with raised beds ready for planting and benches placed to catch the morning sun. "Look what arrived today," Rose said excitedly, leading Amy to a small office. Inside stood a beautiful wooden coat rack. "This is where we'll keep clean clothes and blankets for people who need them. And scarves, of course." She smiled, touching her own scarf again. Lots of scarves. As they stood there, a commotion outside caught their attention. A group of people had gathered on the sidewalk, looking up at the building. Amy recognized some of them as regulars from the local shelter. Rose hurried down to greet them. "When will it open?" one woman asked eagerly. "We've been watching it grow. It's going to be beautiful." Rose spoke with each person, learning their names, hearing their stories. She introduced them to the nursing students, who immediately began taking notes about specific health concerns that would need addressing when the clinic opened. The sun was setting by the time the crowd dispersed, casting long shadows through the new windows. Amy found Rose standing in what would become the clinic's waiting room, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Happy tears," Rose assured her, wiping her eyes. "I just never imagined, when I was out there, I felt so alone. But look at all these people coming together to help others they don't even know." Amy hugged her friend, remembering that cold winter morning that now seemed like a lifetime ago. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "None of us are." As they locked up for the night, the building seemed to pulse with possibility. In just a few more weeks, it would open its doors, ready to offer hope and healing to those who needed it most. But the real transformation had already begun, in the community, in the volunteers, and most of all, in Rose herself. Opening day arrived on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 9 months after that fateful encounter between Amy and Rose. The clinic stood proud against the brightening sky, its freshly painted sign reading Second Chances Community Health Center gleaming in the early light. Inside, Rose walked through the rooms one final time before the doors would open. Everything was ready. The examination room stocked, the community space arranged with comfortable chairs and books, the rooftop garden blooming with late summer flowers. The cashmere scarf hung framed in the entrance hall, alongside the story of how a simple act of kindness had led to this moment. "Are you ready?" Annie asked, finding Rose standing in front of the framed scarf. She had taken the day off work to be here for the opening. "More than ready," Rose replied, smoothing her white doctor's coat. It was the first time she'd worn one in years, and though it felt strange, it also felt right. It's time to give back. At exactly 8 a.m., they opened the doors. Rose had worried that people might be hesitant to come, but she needn't have. A line had already formed outside, made up of faces she recognized from her time on the streets, along with others she'd never seen before. The first patient was the elderly man who had often shared his newspaper with Rose during her homeless days. He entered nervously, clutching his worn cap, but his face lit up when he recognized her. "Doc Rose," he said in disbelief. "Is it really you? We all wondered where you'd gone." Rose hugged him warmly, leading him to an examination room while explaining how she'd found her way back. As she listened to his heart and checked his blood pressure, they talked about the months they'd spent as street companions, neither knowing the other's full story. Throughout the morning, more people came. A young mother with a sick child. A man who hadn't seen a doctor in a decade because he was afraid of being judged. A teenager who had run away from home. Each was treated with dignity and respect, given not just medical care, but also a chance to be heard. In the community room, volunteers served hot coffee and healthy snacks. Social workers sat with patients, helping them navigate paperwork for housing assistance and job training programs. The nursing students moved efficiently between rooms, learning not just about medicine but about compassion. Around noon, a familiar face appeared, the woman who had shared her blanket with Rose during her last winter on the streets. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, until Rose spotted her. "Come in, please," Rose said softly, taking her hand. "Let us help you the way you once helped me." As the woman followed Rose to an examination room, Emmy watched from the front desk, her heart full. The clinic was everything they had hoped for and more, not just a medical facility, but a place of healing for body and spirit alike. The afternoon brought more surprises. Local news crews arrived, wanting to cover the story of the former surgeon who had experienced homelessness and returned to help others. Rose spoke to them briefly, always redirecting attention to the clinic's mission rather than her personal story. "This isn't about me," she told the reporters. "It's about recognizing that every person deserves care and dignity. Sometimes we all need a second chance, and sometimes giving that chance to others helps us find our own way back." As evening approached, the flow of patients finally slowed. The staff gathered in the community room, tired but happy, sharing stories from their first day. The rooftop garden glowed in the sunset, its benches occupied by patients who weren't quite ready to leave the peaceful space. Rose found Amy sitting quietly in a corner, watching it all. "Thank you," she said, sitting beside her friend. "None of this would exist if you hadn't stopped that morning." "I just gave you a scarf," Amy replied, squeezing Rose's hand. "No," Rose said firmly. "You gave me hope. You showed me that kindness still existed in the world. And now look, all this kindness is multiplying, touching more lives every day." They sat together as darkness fell, watching the clinic's lights create a warm glow in the growing dusk. Through the windows, they could see people still talking, laughing, helping each other. The building hummed with life and purpose. A young volunteer approached them with cups of fresh coffee. "Dr. Thompson, there's one more patient asking to see you. She says she can come back tomorrow if you're too tired." Rose stood immediately. "No one gets turned away," she said, straightening her white coat. "That's our promise." 1 year had passed since the Second Chances Clinic opened its doors. On this particular morning, Rose stood in front of a packed auditorium at the local medical school, the familiar cashmere scarf draped elegantly around her shoulders. The audience was a mix of medical students, healthcare professionals, and community members, all gathered to hear about the clinic's groundbreaking approach to caring for the homeless. "Healthcare isn't just about medicine," Rose began, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "It's about seeing the person behind the patient, about understanding that every life has value, every story matters." She paused, touching the scarf. "I learned that lesson twice, first as a doctor, then as someone who needed help myself." In the front row, Annie watched proudly as her friend shared their story. The past year had brought changes neither of them could have imagined. The clinic had grown, adding new services and programs. They'd helped hundreds of people find their way back to health, hope, and in many cases, homes. After the lecture, a group of medical students crowded around Rose, eager to learn more about volunteering at the clinic. Among them was a young woman who looked oddly familiar. "You probably don't remember me," she said shyly, "but you operated on me when I was 6 years old. That's why I decided to become a doctor. And when I heard your story," she wiped away tears, "well, I knew where I wanted to do my residency." These moments happened more and more often now, lives touching lives in an endless chain of connection. The clinic had become known throughout Boston not just for its medical care, but for its humanity. Other cities were starting to take notice, sending representatives to learn how they might replicate the model. Back at the clinic that afternoon, Rose and Amy walked through the bustling halls. The community room was filled with people attending a job skills workshop. In the rooftop garden, patients tended to the vegetables they planted in the spring. The examination rooms were busy with doctors and nurses who volunteered their time, inspired by Rose's example. "Remember when we first started planning this?" Amy asked, watching a group of nursing students help an elderly man learn to use the computer for job searches. "It seemed almost impossible then." Rose nodded, greeting patients as they passed. "The impossible becomes possible when people come together. Look there." She pointed to a woman in scrubs helping at the front desk. "She was one of our first patients. Now she's in nursing school and volunteers here twice a week." The clinic had evolved beyond their initial vision. It now offered dental care, mental health services, and even a small legal aid office. But more importantly, it had created a community where people helped each other heal and grow. As evening approached, Rose led Amy to a special celebration in the community room. Staff, volunteers, and patients had gathered to mark the clinic's first anniversary. The walls were decorated with before and after photos, people who had arrived broken and left whole, stories of transformation and hope. One of the patients stood up to speak, her voice trembling with emotion. "A year ago, I was sleeping in my car, too ashamed to ask for help. Now I have a job, an apartment, and most importantly, my dignity back. This place, it's more than a clinic, it's a family." Others shared their stories too. A former addict who was now 6 months clean and helping others through recovery. A veteran who had finally gotten treatment for PTSD. A young mother who had found the support she needed to leave an abusive situation and start fresh. As Rose listened to these testimonials, she felt tears running down her cheeks. Amy reached over and squeezed her hand, remembering that cold winter morning that had started it all. "I have something to share too," Rose said, standing up. "Next month, we're opening a second clinic across town. And that's just the beginning. Because kindness spreads, hope multiplies, and sometimes the darkest moments in our lives lead us exactly where we need to be." She touched the cashmere scarf, now as much a symbol as a piece of clothing. Never underestimate the power of a simple act of kindness. You never know how far it might reach, how many lives it might touch, how many hearts it might heal. As the celebration continued into the evening, the clinic glowed with warmth and purpose. Outside, the city lights twinkled against the darkening sky, each one perhaps representing another life waiting to be changed, another story waiting to be rewritten. The scarf that had started it all still hung in its frame by the entrance, but its story had grown far beyond a simple gesture between strangers. It had become a reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope exists. That sometimes the hand we reach out to help another ends up lifting us both, and that kindness, once given, creates ripples that never truly end. Redtree.